For 16 years, Daniel Reyes had been the name every department at Kingsley Manufacturing trusted without question. At the company's annual gala, the single father, a man who never spent money on himself, wore a tailored suit for the first time in his life, waiting for the promotion everyone had already told him was his. Instead, Vanessa Kingsley handed the director title to her nephew, a young man 6 months into the job, and then told Daniel that being liked for a long time was not the same thing as leadership. He set down his champagne, resigned on the spot, and walked out. Then the tables behind him started emptying too. The morning after the gala, people at Kingsley Manufacturing talked about Daniel Reyes as though he had been an institution rather than a man. That was closer to the truth than most of them realized. He had walked through the plant doors for the first time 16 years earlier, a technician with grease under his nails and no ambition beyond keeping the second shift running clean. He never applied for attention. He applied for problems, and the company kept handing him bigger ones. Promotion came to him slowly and without ceremony. He fixed a bottling line that 3 outside consultants had already written off, and they made him a shift lead. He rebuilt a changeover procedure that had been costing the company 11 hours a week, and they made him a supervisor. By the time the title Senior Operations Lead finally appeared on his badge, half the floor had already been calling him that for 2 years. Daniel never once negotiated for a raise. He assumed the work would speak for itself, because for 16 years it always had. He arrived most mornings before sunrise and stayed until the second shift handoff. That wasn't devotion to the company so much as a habit he couldn't break. He liked knowing what the building sounded like when it was healthy. He heard a compressor running a half-second long before the sensors caught it. He caught a supplier shorting a pallet before accounting ever flagged the invoice. Most of what he quietly fixed, leadership never learned had happened at all, which was exactly how he liked it, and exactly why it eventually cost him. There was a shelf in his office he never dusted, holding 4 glass awards for Employee of the Year, the engraved dates in type he'd stopped reading. Marcus Webb used to joke that Daniel kept them turned toward the wall out of embarrassment. The truth was simpler. The awards mattered less to him than the people who'd congratulated him for earning them, because those people were the real record of his 16 years. He was a single father who went home each night to a quiet house and a mortgage he carried alone. That fact shaped nothing about how he worked and everything about how carefully he'd planned his life. He'd never taken a financial risk as an adult. He'd built stability slowly, the same way he built everything else, with no margin for drama, which was exactly why the people who knew him best would find what he eventually did at that gala almost impossible to believe. He had trained more of the workforce than anyone in the building, including the actual trainers. Derek Simmons had arrived with a good degree and no idea how a real production line behaved under pressure. In his 4th month, Derek made a sequencing error that cost the company $11,000 in scrapped product. Daniel filed the incident report honestly, then sat with Derek until 8 that night rebuilding the logic so it could never happen again and never mentioned it to anyone afterward. Derek was promoted twice over the next 4 years. The pattern held all the way up the org chart. When a project manager needed to know whether a timeline was honest or fictional, she asked Daniel before she asked her own director. When engineering and quality control spent 3 weeks locked in a standoff over tolerance specs, it was Daniel who put both groups in one room, said almost nothing, and let them discover they'd been arguing over 2 entirely different documents. He had no formal authority over either department. He had something the org chart could never print, and everyone in the building understood it. Sterling Foods, the company's largest account, ran on a compliance protocol Daniel had personally written after their first audit nearly failed. Their operations manager called Daniel's cell phone directly instead of going through account management, and had done so for 6 years. Nobody at Kingsley thought that was unusual. It was simply how things worked. And no one ever stopped to ask what would happen if it stopped working. So when word spread that the director of operations position would open in the spring, the conclusion formed on its own. Nobody campaigned for Daniel, because nobody thought campaigning was necessary. The floor discussed it the way people discuss whether that's already been forecast. Marcus told him flatly that the job was his, and that he should start thinking about who'd replace him on the floor. Daniel let himself believe it. That was the part he'd examine most carefully afterward, the small permission he'd granted himself. After 16 years of assuming the work would speak, he let himself imagine the company was finally about to say it out loud. He was 41. He'd never asked Kingsley for anything, and he thought that was a kind of credit quietly accumulating somewhere, about to be paid out. He didn't know that Vanessa Kingsley had made her decision long before the position was ever posted. Tyler Kingsley had started in October, 6 months before the gala. He arrived with a master's degree from a good school, a handshake he'd clearly practiced, and a laptop full of slides about modernization. Vanessa introduced him at the quarterly meeting as the fresh perspective the company had needed for a while. Nobody thought much of it. Family members had passed through Kingsley before, usually for a summer, usually forgettably. What the building didn't know was that Vanessa had made a promise about Tyler to her sister years earlier, and had been carrying it ever since. She also carried something older. When her father had handed her the company, 2 of his directors had privately called her the daughter who'd inherited a job she hadn't earned, and she'd spent a decade proving she could see further than men who'd merely been present a long time. By the time Tyler arrived, those 2 things had fused into a single instinct she no longer examined. Daniel never treated Tyler as a threat, and that wasn't strategy, it genuinely never occurred to him. When Vanessa asked him to bring Tyler up to speed, Daniel did it the way he did everything, thoroughly and without resentment. He walked Tyler through the plant floor and explained why the line was laid out in an order that looked wrong on paper. He personally introduced him to the team leads, which mattered, because an introduction from Daniel bought a person 6 months of goodwill they hadn't earned. He also quietly fixed Tyler's work. The first proposal Tyler drafted for leadership contained a throughput assumption that would have been laughed out of the room by anyone who'd spent an hour on the floor. Daniel caught it, sat with him for 2 hours one Thursday evening, and rebuilt the numbers together. He never mentioned it to Vanessa or to anyone else. Tyler presented the revised version the following week to approving nods, and Daniel was glad, because a bad proposal reflects on everyone. The shift happened gradually enough to be deniable. In January, Daniel noticed a slide in a leadership deck describing a staged rollout of predictive maintenance scheduling. He recognized it instantly. He'd written it 18 months earlier in a memo that had gone unanswered. The slide carried Tyler's name in the footer. Daniel told himself good ideas travel, and that what mattered was getting it implemented, not owning it. He kept the original memo in his files, because he kept everything. In February, he was quietly dropped from the Monday operations review. No one told him. He walked to the conference room at the usual time and found the door closed, with Tyler inside taking notes. The calendar invite had been revised without a word. When Daniel asked, he was told the meeting had been streamlined and that Tyler would relay anything relevant. Nothing relevant was ever relayed. By March, Vanessa had a phrase she used often enough that people started to notice. The next generation of leadership. She said it at town halls, in emails, and once memorably while standing 3 feet from a man who'd given the company 16 years. She never once looked at Daniel when she said it, which was its own kind of statement. Rachel Foster, who ran human resources, raised the process question once in April, in a meeting with 2 other executives present. She asked how the director role would be evaluated and what criteria would be published. Vanessa told her the search would be internal, that she'd handle it personally, and moved to the next agenda item in under 15 seconds. Rachel wrote a short note in her own file afterward, the way careful people do, and let it go, something she would think about for a long time. Marcus Webb was the one who finally said it plainly. He caught Daniel in the parking lot one Tuesday evening in early April, leaned against the tailgate of Daniel's truck, and told him the director job had already been decided. He'd heard it from someone in finance who'd seen a compensation band drafted with a name attached. Marcus didn't soften it. He'd worked beside Daniel for 9 years and thought he deserved to hear it before the room did. Daniel refused to believe it. He said a company that size doesn't throw away 16 years of documented performance for a nephew with 6 months on the job, because it would be indefensible in front of board members, shareholders, and an entire building full of people who'd watch it happen. He said the numbers were the numbers. Marcus looked at him a moment too long, said he hoped Daniel was right, then got in his car and drove home. That conversation was the last chance Daniel had to protect himself, and he spent it defending the company. He drove home that night and didn't think about it again. He believed, in the total and specific way only someone who's never been betrayed can believe, that the record would hold. The annual gala was held at the Ashford Hotel downtown, in a ballroom with a ceiling that made everyone speak slightly quieter than usual. 340 people attended. Round tables with white cloths, a bar at each end, a small stage with a podium and a microphone someone always adjusted to Vanessa's height beforehand. Daniel had bought a suit. That was not a small thing. He owned exactly one jacket, kept for funerals. The week before the gala, he'd walked into a downtown store and let a salesman measure him for the first time in his adult life. Charcoal, properly tailored, a tie he wasn't quite sure about. It cost more than he'd ever spent on clothing, and he thought twice about the number before paying it. He bought it because half a dozen people at work had told him this would be the most important night of his career. He arrived early and shook a lot of hands. Derek told him the suit made him look like a man about to be handed something, and Daniel said he'd settle for the shrimp. Marcus found him near the bar and didn't bring up the parking lot conversation, and Daniel was grateful for that. The room was warm and loud and full of people who'd already decided they were watching a good thing happen to a man who deserved it. Vanessa took the stage after dinner. She thanked the sales division for a strong quarter. She thanked the plant for 14 months without a lost time incident, Daniel's record, built on Daniel's protocols, and never said his name. Then she said she had one more announcement, the one everyone had been waiting for, and the room shifted the way a room does when several hundred people turn slightly in the same direction. Faces at Daniel's table turned toward him before the name was even spoken. He felt the specific heat of being watched by a crowd and set his hands flat on the tablecloth, not knowing what else to do with them. Vanessa announced that the new director of operations was Tyler Kingsley. The applause started and then never fully arrived, a thin scatter from the executive tables up front that didn't spread. The rest of the ballroom made a sound that wasn't quite silence, a kind of collective intake of breath. 340 people simultaneously deciding not to react. Tyler stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the stage through a room that had gone strange. Vanessa spoke about fresh thinking and young energy, about the company needing modern leadership that understood where the industry was going rather than where it had been. Every person who'd ever called Daniel Reyes at 9 at night with a problem understood exactly what was being said, and exactly who it was being said about. Tyler thanked his aunt, said he was honored, said he looked forward to learning from the incredible team. Somewhere at a back table, a fork hit a plate loudly enough to be heard. Daniel didn't move. He sat through the closing remarks and the invitation to enjoy the bar. When the room began breaking apart into standing conversation, he crossed to where Vanessa was accepting congratulations from a regional sales director, waited until she was free, and quietly asked her, without any heat in his voice, whether his record had been considered at all. Vanessa looked at him with something close to patience. She told him that doing a job well for a long time wasn't the same as being ready to lead it. She said people like Daniel, that he was the kind of man a plant floor grows fond of, and that being well liked is often mistaken for leadership potential. She said she needed someone who could see past the way things had always been done. Then she touched his arm briefly, the way people do when a conversation is over, and turned back toward the room. Daniel stood there in the suit he'd bought for this night and looked at everything in front of him. Tyler, laughing near the stage with two vice presidents, 6 months into a company whose floor plan he couldn't have drawn from memory. Vanessa, moving between tables. Marcus, 20 feet away, watching him with an expression that held no surprise at all. And Daniel understood that the promotion wasn't really what had happened tonight. What had happened was that 340 people had just watched, live and with a microphone, exactly what 16 years of documented excellence was worth against a family name. If he stayed, if he showed up Monday, did the handoff, kept the building running, he'd be signing his name to that lesson. He'd become living proof it was survivable, and every technician on that floor would learn from him exactly where the ceiling was. He set the champagne glass down on the nearest table, untouched. He found Vanessa again near the edge of the room, and this time he didn't lower his voice. He told her he was resigning, effective immediately, and that she'd have it in writing by morning. She said his name once, with the beginning of a smile, the way an adult addresses someone having a moment. Daniel didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. He turned and walked toward the doors. The room noticed. Conversations shortened and then stopped as he passed, a wave traveling with him table by table. By the time he was halfway across the floor, several hundred people were watching a man in a new charcoal suit walk out of a party thrown partly in his honor. Vanessa felt nothing like alarm. He was proud, she told herself, and pride cools by morning. He'd call HR embarrassed, and they'd find a way to keep him. Men like Daniel Reyes didn't leave companies. They stayed 16 years, and then they stayed longer. She was still holding that thought when, at a table near the center of the room, Marcus Webb stood up. He didn't make a speech. He unclipped his badge, set it face up on the white tablecloth beside his water glass, and walked toward the doors with his jacket over his arm. That small object left on the table did more damage to the room than anything anyone could have shouted. Vanessa saw it from across the ballroom and felt the first thing she'd later recognize as fear, though at the time she filed it as irritation. Marcus had 9 years with the company and ran the maintenance program that kept plant downtime under 2%. He wasn't a man given to gestures, which was exactly what made the gesture land. Derek was next. He stood without hurry, said something quiet to the woman beside him, and followed Marcus's path across the room. Then a controls engineer pushed back his chair. Then a project manager with 11 years at the company stood, gathered her purse, and left her dessert untouched. Then 2 more, both old enough at Kingsley to remember when Vanessa's father ran it. Nobody chanted. Nobody announced anything. There was no organizer moving between tables, no signal passed. It was quieter than a walkout should have been, and that quiet was what made it unbearable to watch. People decided one at a time, in real time, and then acted on it in front of every colleague they had. Daniel had reached the corridor when he realized he wasn't alone. He turned and saw them coming, 6, then 8, and something in him tightened. He told them plainly they didn't need to do this, that he'd made a decision for himself, that it wasn't anyone else's to inherit, that he'd never asked for company. Marcus answered for all of them. He said they weren't following Daniel anywhere. He said they'd just watched a man give 16 years to a building and be told, in front of everyone he knew, that it didn't count for much, and once a person sees that clearly, he can't keep pretending he didn't. They weren't leaving for Daniel. They were choosing their own futures. Inside, the same question moved through the tables the way smoke moves without anyone carrying it. If a man could give 16 years, win the award 4 times, train half the floor, write the protocols that held the biggest account, and still get passed over the moment the CEO wanted her nephew in the chair, then what exactly was everyone else working toward? It wasn't an accusation. It was arithmetic, and every person in that room quietly ran the numbers. The tables emptied by degrees. Some people left immediately. Others finished their drinks, said normal goodbyes, and went home early carrying something new. By 10 o'clock, a ballroom built for 340 held maybe 90, and the band kept playing to a floor nobody was dancing on. Vanessa stood near the stage with a glass she'd stopped drinking from. Tyler came to find her, his face wrong, asking what was happening. She told him people get emotional at parties, that it would look different on Monday. She said it with the certainty of a woman who'd run the company for 11 years and had never yet been proven wrong in public. She was wrong. What she'd watched wasn't the end of anything. It was the first 90 minutes. Rachel Foster opened her laptop early Monday morning and found 9 resignation letters waiting. By noon there were 14. By Wednesday, 26. By the end of the second week, 34, and the number kept climbing 2 and 3 at a time through the following weeks until, 5 Mondays after the gala, the tracker read 41. Vanessa's first instinct was to look for a pattern she could dismiss. She expected the names to cluster around Daniel, his shift, his direct reports, the people he ate lunch with. That would have been manageable, a loyalty problem with one source and one fix. But the names didn't cluster. They came from engineering and operations, quality control and project management, logistics and scheduling. A senior buyer resigned who'd spoken to Daniel maybe a dozen times in 4 years. A quality supervisor resigned who'd once formally challenged one of Daniel's process changes. These weren't his people. Many barely knew him. Rachel ran the exit interviews herself, because she wanted to hear it directly. She began hearing the same sentence in different voices, so consistently that she started recording it word for word to check whether people were literally using the same language. They nearly were. If Daniel Reyes has no path here, why should I believe I have one? That was the whole crisis compressed into a single question. Rachel understood immediately it had stopped being about Daniel. He was the evidence, not the cause. What the gala had destroyed was the belief that advancement at Kingsley Manufacturing was connected to performance at all, and once that belief goes, good work stops feeling like an investment and starts feeling like a donation. The younger employees took it hardest. They'd built their next 5 years around a ladder they now understood to be ornamental. A process engineer in her 20s told Rachel she'd turned down an outside offer 8 months earlier because Daniel had assured her that if she kept building her record, the record would carry her. She wasn't bitter at Daniel. She was bitter about having believed him and about the fact that he'd believed it too. Meanwhile, Tyler walked into the director's office and discovered what the title actually contained. He'd inherited a department where 4 of 17 team leads had resigned or were serving notice, where the maintenance program had no manager, and where the people who remained answered his questions with the bare minimum professional courtesy required. He'd been promoted into a room the best people were leaving. Every week the department became a slightly weaker version of the one he'd been handed, and nothing in his education had prepared him for authority that produced no movement. Vanessa refused, through all of it, to treat her own decision as the variable. She told the executive team the company was in a difficult transition, and that transitions expose people who were never fully committed. More than once she remarked that anyone willing to abandon a company over a promotion they didn't receive had told her something useful about themselves. She had Rachel open new job postings at 10 to 15% above the previous pay bands and fill them fast. She gave Tyler full authority over operations and told him to prove the company ran exactly as it always had. She wasn't trying to solve the problem. She was trying to prove there was no problem, a different task, and a far more expensive one. The failures started within 3 weeks. A capital project to upgrade the packaging line slipped its schedule twice, then a third time, because the sequencing depended on shutdown windows Daniel had negotiated informally with 3 departments over the years and never written down, because he'd never needed to. Nobody could reconstruct them. Nobody even knew they existed until they didn't. Sterling Foods was the one that drew blood. Their operations manager called about the upcoming compliance audit, asked for Daniel by name as he had for 6 years, and was told by an account coordinator that Daniel Reyes was no longer with the company. The line went quiet, then the man asked carefully when that had happened and why nobody had told him. 2 days later, Sterling's compliance director requested a full review of Kingsley's audit readiness before committing to the next contract term. A term worth roughly a third of the plant's annual volume. Inside the building, the people who stayed absorbed the work of the people who left. The quality group that used to run with 9 people now ran with 6, covering the same output. Overtime climbed. Shifts ran with gaps filled by whoever was nearest rather than whoever was qualified. Small errors started appearing where they hadn't in years, each one costing time to catch and time to fix, and there was no time to spare. Then something happened that Rachel flagged as more serious than the resignations. Internal candidates began withdrawing from open management postings. 4 people pulled their applications in a single week, and none claimed to be unqualified or uninterested. They said they didn't believe the selection process was real. They'd watched one selection get made, drawn the obvious conclusion, and weren't going to spend 6 weeks preparing for a decision already made somewhere else. Tyler tried to lead the only way the position had taught him. He requested reports, held meetings, set deadlines, escalated when deadlines slipped. He used the authority the title gave him and discovered it produced compliance and nothing else. People did exactly what he formally required and not one step further. What he didn't have, and couldn't requisition, was the thing Daniel had spent 16 years building. When Daniel asked a maintenance crew to stay 2 hours late, they stayed, because at some point he'd covered for one of them, or fixed something, or told their manager the truth on their behalf. That network appeared in no file. It had been built one favor at a time, and it had walked out of the Ashford Hotel in a charcoal suit. Vanessa arrived at the explanation that let her keep her position intact. She decided Daniel was orchestrating it. She said so in a leadership meeting. That a man doesn't leave a gala and have 40 people follow him without coordination, that he must be working the phones, encouraging people, maybe even recruiting for a competitor. Rachel didn't argue in the meeting. She checked instead. She reviewed Daniel's company email through his last day and found nothing. She reviewed the internal messaging logs. She read all 41 exit interview transcripts looking for any sign he'd contacted, approached, encouraged, or organized anyone. There was nothing. Not one employee reported hearing from him. Several volunteered, unprompted, that they'd reached out to him and that he'd discouraged nobody from staying. 2 said he'd told them to think carefully and do what was right for their own circumstances, and 1 said he'd told her the company still had good people in it. Daniel had organized nothing. He'd posted nothing, spoken to no reporter, sent no message. He'd gone home, and 41 people had made their own decisions afterward. Rachel wrote that in a plain memo and didn't send it to Vanessa. She sent it directly to Harold Pierce, the board chair, knowing exactly what it meant to go over the head of a chief executive already looking for someone to blame. She attached her April note about the missing selection criteria too, which implicated her own silence as much as anyone's. Harold Pierce had chaired the Kingsley board for 4 years and had a reputation for asking few questions and unpleasant ones. He called an emergency session in the 5th week, when attrition hit 41, and opened it with zero interest in the walkout itself. He said he wasn't there to ask what Daniel Reyes had done. The question that mattered was different, and far worse. Why had one promotion decision caused 41 people across 6 departments to simultaneously lose confidence in their own futures at this company? Because that wasn't a personnel event. That was a structural finding. He asked for Daniel's file first. It arrived noticeably thick, and Harold read from it aloud while Vanessa sat at the far end of the table. 16 years of service, top band performance reviews for 12 consecutive years, for company awards, a training record showing 38 employees formally developed under him, at least 9 now in supervisory roles, authorship or major revision of 14 standard operating procedures still in active use, including the entire Sterling Foods compliance protocol. 14 months on his shift without a lost time incident, and in 16 years, not one documented complaint about his leadership, conduct, or judgment. Then Rachel placed 2 documents side by side in front of the chair. The first was the leadership deck slide on predictive maintenance scheduling carrying Tyler's name in the footer. The second was the original memo from the shared drive, timestamped 18 months earlier, authored by Daniel Reyes, containing the exact same rollout sequence in the exact same order. She didn't editorialize. She said only that the file history was intact and available to anyone who wanted to open it. Harold asked for Tyler's file. It arrived thin, and everyone watched it cross the table. 6 months at the company, 1 check-in review conducted by Vanessa herself, no supervisory experience before Kingsley, no direct reports prior to the promotion, a strong academic record, and a set of proposals, one of which the version history showed had been substantially rebuilt by another employee before it was ever submitted. Harold set the second folder on top of the first and asked Vanessa a single question. If Tyler weren't her nephew, would that file have been enough to move him past Daniel Reyes? The room waited. Vanessa had spent 5 weeks constructing a defense out of transitions and commitment in modern leadership and young energy, and every piece of it depended on an answer to that question. There was no answer. She looked at the 2 folders and said nothing. Harold didn't press, because the silence had already done its work in front of the entire board. What broke in that room wasn't Vanessa's authority. It was her ability to keep telling herself the decision had ever been about the company. She'd told a man that being liked for a long time wasn't the same as being ready to lead, and she'd said it to the one person in the building whose record could survive that sentence being applied to it. In doing so, with a microphone in front of 340 employees, she'd said something she never meant to say. That effort doesn't determine your future here. She'd lost Daniel Reyes in 90 seconds. She'd lost everyone else's belief that the work meant anything. And that second loss came with no resignation letter attached, which was exactly why it would be so much harder to win back. The resignations didn't stop after the board meeting. 6 more arrived the following week, and what alarmed Rachel most was that 2 came from people who'd told her a month earlier they intended to stay and see how things developed. They'd seen how things developed. The board had opened an inquiry, nothing on the floor had visibly changed, and they'd drawn the obvious conclusion. Harold gave Vanessa a direct instruction: stop the bleeding and report to him weekly. He didn't remove her, which surprised several board members, but he made the terms clear enough that she understood her position was no longer permanent by default. The company responded the way companies do. Compensation reviews were accelerated. Retention bonuses were approved across 3 tiers, the largest substantial enough that Rachel checked the figure twice before sending the letters. Promotions that had been stuck in the pipeline for 18 months were suddenly approved in a single afternoon. Vanessa authorized all of it within a week and genuinely believed she'd solved the problem. The refusals came back within days. A senior controls engineer turned down a retention bonus worth 11 months of salary and gave notice that same afternoon. A logistics manager accepted a promotion she'd wanted for 2 years, then resigned 2 weeks later anyway. People took the money and left, or refused the money and left. Either way, they left. Rachel finally said it plainly in Vanessa's office with the door closed. The company was trying to solve a trust problem with a compensation solution, and the two weren't interchangeable. Money answers what a job is worth. It doesn't answer whether effort leads anywhere. And that was the question 47 people had now asked and answered for themselves. Through all of it, Daniel was gone in the most complete sense possible. He posted nothing. He gave no statement to the local business paper when they called, twice. He didn't contact a single former colleague, and when former colleagues contacted him, he asked about their prospects and declined to discuss Kingsley at all. His own situation wasn't comfortable. He'd walked away from 16 years of income, with a mortgage and no severance, because a resignation delivered at a party doesn't come with a package. He interviewed twice in the first month. Both times, the same careful question came up: why does a man leave a company after 16 years with nothing else lined up? Both times he watched the answer change something in the room. Neither call came back. He started calculating how many months his savings would cover, and the number was smaller than he wanted. That silence turned out to be the most damaging fact in the whole situation, because it removed the last available excuse. If Daniel had been loud, the board could have called it a campaign. His silence made it obvious that nothing was being done to the company from outside. The company was doing it to itself and had been doing it long before he ever set that glass down. Harold understood this before Vanessa did. He told her, in a call that lasted 4 minutes, that she was going to phone Daniel Reyes personally, not through a recruiter, not through Rachel, and that she was going to do it that day. She called him at 3 that afternoon, and he picked up on the 4th ring. She didn't open with an apology. She opened with an offer, because that was the language she was fluent in. Director of Operations, effective immediately, at a salary well above what Tyler had been given, and above what the role had ever paid. Daniel listened without interrupting. He was standing in his kitchen with a stack of bills on the counter and a savings number in his head, and he told her no. The chair had never been the actual problem. If the company was handing him the title now, it was only because 47 people had left and a major customer was asking hard questions. Which made him the fix for a staffing emergency, not the answer to a question about how decisions get made. If the seat was only open because the room had emptied, then nobody there had actually understood what went wrong, and he had no interest in being installed as a patch on a system that would produce the same night again in 3 years, with someone else standing in that ballroom. Vanessa set the phone down and sat with it. She'd spent 5 weeks building a version of events where Daniel was proud, wounded, and opportunistic. In 4 minutes, he'd turned down a raise and, without ever raising his voice, made clear she still didn't understand what had happened at her own party. What changed his mind was a phone call 9 days later. A young technician he'd trained called to ask his advice, because Kingsley had just posted 2 supervisory openings and she wanted to know if applying was worth her time. She told him the postings listed no criteria at all, and that the hiring manager for both was Tyler. Daniel hung up and sat in his kitchen for a long while. He'd assumed walking out was the whole statement, and now he saw it wasn't. The people who'd left were fine, or would be. The people still inside were being handed the exact same system that had produced the gala in the first place, and his silence wasn't protecting any of them. Refusing the chair had cost him a great deal and changed nothing for a single person still badging in at that building. He called Harold Pierce the next morning, not Vanessa, and asked for a meeting with the full board. He came in without a lawyer and without a list of grievances, just 5 conditions written on one page, which he read in order. Every management position would carry published, objective competency criteria, defined before the posting opened and applied identically to every candidate. Demonstrated performance would be evaluated ahead of personal relationships in every selection, with the evaluation documented. No family member of any executive would be exempt from the standard hiring and promotion process, without exception, regardless of role. Every employee would have a defined advancement path, so a person could see exactly what the next level required and know whether their effort actually led anywhere. And the people who'd resigned would decide for themselves, with no outreach campaign, no pressure, and no involvement from him, whether to come back. A board member asked if Daniel intended to help bring people back. He said no. Those 47 had made decisions about their own futures using information the company had given them publicly. If the company wanted them back, it would have to give them different information, not a phone call from him. What they'd done at the gala, they'd done on their own, and he wasn't going to take ownership of it now that it had become useful to somebody. He didn't ask for Tyler to be fired, which surprised the room more than anything else on the page. Tyler had been handed something he never competed for, and that was a failure of process, not a crime committed by a young man whose aunt offered him a job. The right response was to evaluate him the same way everyone else would now be evaluated. If he had real ability, he could prove it against the same criteria as anyone else, and nobody would have grounds to question him again. Then Daniel named the one condition with no dollar figure attached, the one that couldn't be delegated to HR. Vanessa would have to acknowledge the mistake in front of the same people who'd watched it happen. Not a memo. Not a values statement drafted by communications. The injury had been public, and a private correction would never reach the people who'd been hurt by watching it in public. Vanessa resisted for 2 days. She told Harold that a public admission would permanently destroy her standing with the workforce, that no chief executive survives standing in front of the whole company and admitting she was wrong. He told her the workforce had already left in every sense that mattered, that 47 exit interviews had established that in writing, and the only remaining question was whether she wanted to rebuild it or keep defending a version of it that no longer existed. What finally moved her was smaller, and happened alone. Late one night, in an empty office, she pulled the 2 folders out again and read her own words back from the exit interview transcripts. She'd spent a decade making sure nobody could say she'd simply been handed the company. Then she'd handed the company's best department to her nephew, using the exact language 2 men had once used about her, aimed at the one person in the building who had genuinely earned everything he had. The all-hands meeting was held in the plant's largest bay, because no conference room in the building could hold everyone who remained. People stood on the floor and along the mezzanine. Tyler stood at the back, on no platform. Vanessa came in without a prepared speech and without the language the communications team had drafted for her. Tyler's promotion, she said, had not gone through a fair evaluation process. No competency criteria had ever been defined. No other candidates had been formally assessed. She had made the decision before the position was even posted. She said it flatly, as fact rather than confession, which was the only way it could have landed as true. She admitted she'd learned to hear the word experience as a synonym for resistance to change, and trust as a synonym for popularity, and that she'd used both words as weapons against a man whose record proved they meant something else entirely at Kingsley. She had stood in a ballroom and told him that being liked for a long time wasn't the same as leadership, and she'd said it to the person who had trained 38 employees and written the protocols holding the company's largest customer in place. Then came the part that mattered more than the apology. Her decision, she told them, had sent a message to every single person in that building. That no matter how hard they worked, a personal relationship could still outweigh their competence. She hadn't intended to send that message, Intent was irrelevant. It had been received clearly, because it was accurate. Nobody applauded. That was appropriate, and she seemed to understand it. Tyler was removed from the director role that week and placed in a position matching his actual experience, reporting to a manager instead of running a department. He didn't contest it. He'd spent nearly 2 months in that office learning exactly what a title can't buy. An independent selection process opened for Director of Operations, run by the board with an external assessor, using published criteria applied identically to every candidate. It took 6 weeks. 4 people applied. Daniel Reyes was one of them, and he went through every stage exactly like everyone else, including the panel interview and the written operational assessment. He was selected. The board's documentation ran 9 pages, citing his performance history, his development record, his authorship of the company's core procedures, and assessment scores that were the highest of the 4 by a clear margin. This time he didn't take the chair because a room had emptied. He took it because a process had been built that he could actually pass, and because his file, examined honestly by people with no stake in protecting a family name, said what it had always said. He returned in July, 3 months after the gala, and the first thing he made explicit to everyone who'd left was that they owed him nothing. He hadn't asked them to go. He wasn't asking them to come back. Their careers were not a debt owed to his situation. Marcus Webb returned first, which surprised nobody. He'd had a standing offer from a competitor and turned it down. When Rachel asked, during the rehire paperwork, what had changed his mind, he said he'd read the new promotion policy twice, and that it was the first document the company had produced in 9 years that told him plainly what his effort was actually worth. Derek Simmons came back 5 weeks later, after the first posting under the new criteria closed, and he watched a supervisor role go to a candidate with no relationship to anyone in leadership. That was the proof he'd been waiting for. Not the policy itself, but a single decision made under the policy that could have gone the old way and didn't. Others returned over the following months, though not everyone. The project manager who'd left her dessert on the table took a role closer to home and stayed there. 2 engineers had already started somewhere else and were building something they didn't want to abandon. Daniel never tried to pull anyone back, and when one of them called to explain herself, he told her she'd made a good decision and meant it. Sterling Foods completed its readiness review that autumn and renewed for 3 years. Their compliance director noted in the closing letter that the protocol had been rebuilt to its original standard by its original author, the only line in the entire document Harold read aloud at the next board meeting. Tyler changed slowly and without announcement. He stopped leading with the family name and started spending real time on the floor, where he was at first tolerated rather than welcomed. He came to Daniel's office once, early on, and admitted he'd known within a month that he wasn't ready, and hadn't known how to say so to his aunt without it sounding like ingratitude. Daniel told him the useful part was still available to him, and that nothing in his file was permanent except what he chose to put in it next. Within a year, Tyler had a small operational record entirely his own. When he eventually applied for a supervisory role, he went through the same process as everyone else and won it on the assessment. Vanessa remained chief executive under board conditions and an 18-month governance review. She and Daniel worked together the way 2 professionals do when the past is neither forgotten nor discussed. She approved his framework without amendment, sat through his operational reviews, and never once overrode him on a personnel decision. What she carried out of that year was narrower than a lesson about nepotism. Holding the authority to decide had never once made her decisions correct, and the office was a mechanism for acting, not a substitute for being right. Daniel never used his position against the people who dismissed him. He didn't push Tyler out of the company. He didn't press for Vanessa's removal, even when he could have. Instead, he spent his first year as director building the advancement framework he demanded, so that the next person with 16 years and 4 awards on a shelf would never have to learn at a party what the company actually thought of them. A company doesn't lose its best people on the day they hand in a resignation letter. It starts losing them the day they realize that effort, competence, and loyalty no longer determine their future. Advancement shouldn't be a reward for proximity. It should be the outcome of demonstrated capability, results, and accountability visible to everyone, and apply to everyone. And any leader should remember this. When an excellent employee walks out over an injustice, the people who remain aren't just watching the person going through the door. They're beginning to ask whether they should be next.